Just another domestic. Bag her and tag her with the rest of the staff. We don't have time for civilians. The voice, laced with the casual cruelty of a man who saw people as obstacles, crackled through the comms. The crowd, a disciplined unit of 100 professional soldiers, didn't laugh, but a wave of dismissive assent rippled through their ranks. They were the Iron 100, the most feared private military company on the market, and their leader, a man who called himself Warlock, had just sealed the Housekeeper's fate with a bored flick of his wrist. In the central monitoring room of the Thorn estate, a sprawling fortress of glass and steel carved into a desolate mountainside, Warlock watched the woman on the screen. She was of indeterminate middle age, her hair tied back in a simple, severe bun. Her uniform was a plain gray dress, practical and devoid of any personality. As alarms shrieked and strobe lights painted the marble corridors in frantic strokes of red, she was doing the impossible. She was polishing silver. Her hands, steady and sure, moved a soft cloth over the intricate filigree of a Georgian-era candelabra. There was no panic in her posture, no fear in the set of her shoulders. It was a study in profound, almost unnerving calm. Warlock scoffed, a dry, rasping sound. Look at her. Probably short-circuited. The sheep always freeze before the slaughter, but one of his men, a veteran named Jaeger whose eyes were older than his years, leaned closer to the monitor, a flicker of unease in his gaze. He saw not shock but focus. He saw not a freeze response, but a meditative rhythm. It was the calm of a predator, not of prey. In the main house, where the billionaire Marcus Thorn was being hustled towards his panic room by his personal security detail, the general on the video link he was still connected to saw it too. General Madsen, a man who had commanded armies and seen the face of war in a dozen countries, watched the unassuming Housekeeper on Thorn's security feed. He saw her place the polished candelabra perfectly in the center of the mahogany dining table. He saw her fold the polishing cloth into a perfect square. He saw the way she stood, feet shoulder-width apart, her center of gravity low, her head on a swivel, not looking at the chaos but listening to it. Madsen's blood ran cold. He knew that stance. It was a ghost from a past he rarely spoke of. It was a stance that had been drilled into the most elite, most secret, most lethal operators the world had ever known. A stance that preceded the reaping of a whirlwind. If you believe true strength needs no announcement and competence is its own credential, type silence below. Warlock's voice was a low growl of impatience, a predator eager to close on its quarry. Alpha Team, breach the West Wing. Bravo, secure the East. Charlie, you're with me, Central Axis. I want Thorn alive, but his guards are fair game. We're on a clock, people. Let's not dawdle. His men moved with the fluid lethality that a decade of conflict in forgotten corners of the world had taught them. They were a symphony of violence, each man an instrument of precise destruction. They flowed through the grand entrance hall of the Thorn estate like a black tide, their high-tech gear a stark, brutalist contrast to the opulent tapestries and priceless art that lined the walls. They expected resistance. They were prepared for Thorn's highly paid, but ultimately corporate security team. What they encountered was something else entirely. It began with the lights. One moment, the corridor was a chaotic canvas of emergency strobes. The next, it was plunged into absolute, impenetrable darkness. A collective grunt of surprise echoed through the comms, followed by the clicks of night vision goggles being activated. Warlock sneered. Amateurs. They cut the power. Stick to the plan, but it wasn't a simple power cut. The emergency generators didn't kick in. The backup systems were dead. It was a surgical severing, not a blunt trauma. In the sudden, oppressive blackness, the acoustics of the mansion changed. Every scuff of a boot, every rustle of gear, every nervous breath was magnified. And then a new sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper of movement from above. One of the men in Alpha Team, a hulking brute named Rhino, looked up into the vaulted ceiling, his green-tinted vision scanning the darkness. He saw nothing. He was about to dismiss it when a length of what looked like piano wire, thin and deadly, dropped from the shadows. It looped around his throat with impossible speed and precision. He didn't even have time to scream. He was just gone, lifted silently into the rafters like a puppet on a string. His squad mates felt a sudden cold spot where his massive frame had been. They saw his feet dangling for a brief, horrifying second before they vanished completely. A choked whisper came over the comms. Rhino's gone. Warlock's voice was sharp, cutting. What do you mean, gone? Report. But there was no report. There was only a new sound. A soft thud from the far end of the hall. Then another, and another. Bravo team, clearing the east wing, reported contact. But it wasn't a firefight. It was a series of panicked, cut-off shouts. Hostile in the library. She's using the books. A heavy thud, a wet crack, and then silence. The housekeeper, Elena, moved not like a person, but like an idea. She was a whisper in the dark, a phantom that used the environment with an intimacy that felt supernatural. She knew every shadow, every secret passage, every loose floorboard. This house wasn't just where she worked, it was her territory. It was her weapon. The polished silver candelabra she had so carefully attended to was now a bludgeon, its weight perfectly balanced to crush a larynx. A priceless Faberge egg became a projectile, striking a mercenary's temple with the force of the stone, disorienting him just long enough for the knife she'd taken from the butcher's block in the kitchen to find the soft tissue beneath his jaw. The mercenaries, these hardened killers who had faced down entire armies, were being hunted. They were the invaders, the predators, but the ecosystem of this house had a far more efficient apex predator, and she had just been awakened. The chaos on the comms channel was a rising crescendo of fear and disbelief. Warlock listened, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the console. His initial arrogance was curdling into a venomous rage. This was impossible. 100 of the world's best soldiers, armed with state-of-the-art weaponry, were being dismantled by what? A ghost? A phantom in a gray dress? He barked orders, trying to regain control, to impose his will on a situation that was rapidly spiraling into a nightmare. All teams fall back to the atrium. Form a perimeter. I want thermal scans on every level. Now, the remaining mercenaries, their numbers already depleted by a dozen, scrambled to obey. They moved with a new kind of urgency, not the confident stride of the hunter, but the panicked retreat of the hunted. They reached the grand, three-story atrium, its glass ceiling showing the storm raging outside, and formed a defensive circle, weapons pointing outward into the encompassing darkness. The silence that fell was worse than the screaming. It was heavy, expectant. Every man was listening, his senses strained to the breaking point, trying to pinpoint a threat that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, from the grand staircase, came a sound, not a footstep. It was the soft, rhythmic creak of a cleaning cart's wheel. A single, small, unassuming housekeeping cart rolled slowly down the marble steps, one wheel squeaking a lonely, repetitive protest. It was a deliberate, mocking act. The mercenaries tensed, rifles aimed at the cart as if it were a bomb. It reached the bottom of the stairs and rolled to a gentle stop in the center of their perimeter. On top of the cart, neatly arranged, were the dog tags of their fallen comrades. 12 sets, wiped clean of blood, stacked in a perfect, gleaming pyramid. It was a message. It was a monument to their failure. A younger mercenary, his nerves shattering, opened fire, his rifle stitching a line of sparks across the marble floor as he riddled the cart with bullets. The clatter of plastic and metal echoed in the vast space, a hollow, pathetic sound. Warlock's voice was a roar of fury over the comms. "Cease fire, you idiot! Hold your positions!" But the spell was broken. The demonstration was complete. From the shadows on the second-floor balcony, a shape detached itself from the darkness. It was Elena. In one hand, she held a heavy-duty fire extinguisher. She didn't brandish it like a weapon. She held it with the placid efficiency of someone about to put out a small fire. With a single, fluid motion, she pulled the pin, aimed it not at the men but at the floor in front of them, and squeezed the handle. A massive cloud of CO2 vapor billowed out, not as an attack but as a screen. The whiteout conditions instantly blinded them, their thermal and night vision optics rendered useless by the sudden, extreme temperature change. They were deaf, blind, and utterly disoriented. And into that cloud of chaos, she descended. They never saw her. They only felt the results. A rifle, but to the jaw. A precisely aimed elbow to the temple. A leg sweep that sent a man crashing to the floor, his helmet cracking against the marble. She moved through their ranks like a surgeon, disabling, not killing. Each movement was a study in economy, a perfect application of force to the most vulnerable point. It was over in 30 seconds. When the cloud dissipated, 16 more of the Iron 100 were lying on the floor, groaning, disarmed, and neutralized. The rest stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the woman had been, their professional discipline shattered, replaced by a primal, superstitious fear. They were no longer soldiers on a mission. They were children in the dark, terrified of the monster under the bed. Inside the titanium-walled panic room, Marcus Thorne, a man used to controlling markets and bending governments to his will, felt the unfamiliar sting of pure helplessness. He watched the security monitors, his face a mask of disbelief. He had hired Elena 5 years ago. Her references were impeccable, if sparse. She was quiet, efficient, and utterly invisible, the perfect domestic for a man who valued his privacy above all else. He knew her as the woman who arranged his books by color, who knew exactly how he liked his coffee, who could remove any stain from any fabric. He was now watching that same woman dismantle a private army with a fire extinguisher and what looked like martial arts he'd only seen in movies. Beside him, on a large screen, General Madsen's face was grim, but a flicker of something else was in his eyes, dawning recognition and a profound, solemn respect. "Marcus," Madsen said, his voice low and urgent, "forget the mercenaries. Tell me everything you know about your housekeeper. Her full name. Where did you find her?" Thorne, flustered, typed frantically on a nearby keyboard. Elena Rostova. The agency was a discreet one out of Geneva. They said she had experience with high-net-worth individuals. Her background check was clean. Ex-military, they said. Some kind of logistical support role in the Balkans. Nothing like this. Madsen shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen where Elena, having vanished from the atrium, was now visible in the West Wing, methodically disabling a remote detonated breaching charge. "Logistics," Madsen murmured, a humorless smile touching his lips. "That's one way to put it." Meanwhile, Warlock was experiencing a similar crisis of faith. His command center, once a hub of calm, professional control, was now a scene of barely suppressed panic. "Find her," he bellowed at his tech operator, a pale, sweating man named Glitch. "I want to know who the hell she is. Hack the estate's main server, bypass the employee firewalls. I want her file. I want her name. I want to know who trained this demon." Glitch's fingers flew across his holographic keyboard, lines of code scrolling past in a green waterfall. The estate's security was formidable, but Glitch was a master of his craft. He peeled back layers of encryption, bypassed security protocols, and finally broke through to the HR database. He pulled up the file for Elena Rostova. It was, as Thorne had said, sparse. A photo, a birth date, a sanitized service record. But Glitch saw something else. Embedded in the file, hidden behind a level of encryption that made the estate security look like a child's toy, was a single alphanumeric string. It was an old designation, a ghost code from the Cold War. He didn't recognize it, but he knew someone who would. He forwarded the string to Warlock's own intelligence support, a shadowy figure known only as the Oracle. The reply came back in less than a minute. It was not a file. It was a single, terrified sentence. "Abort mission. Burn your comms. Disappear. You are hunting a Vimple." Warlock stared at the word. Vimple. It meant nothing to him. A second message came through, this one from the Oracle directly to Warlock's private channel. It was an audio file. Warlock played it. It was the voice of General Madsen, speaking from inside the panic room. A live feed the Oracle had clearly hacked. Madsen's voice was filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. "Marcus, The file is a lie. She was never in logistics. That name, Rostova, is an alias. Her unit wasn't just military. They were a myth. They were the ones governments sent when they needed a god of death to solve a problem they couldn't admit they had. They were called the Silents. They didn't exist. Officially, she doesn't exist. There are maybe 5 of them left in the world. You don't have a housekeeper, Marcus. You have a relic of a bygone war, a woman whose entire life was the art of the perfect kill. The mercenaries aren't hunting you. They stumbled into her home, and she is simply cleaning. The revelation hit Warlock like a physical blow. Vimple, the Silence. The names echoed in the silent spaces of his mind, fragments of old intelligence briefings, of barroom stories told by grizzled veterans who had seen too much. They were boogeymen, campfire tales meant to scare new recruits. They weren't supposed to be real. They certainly weren't supposed to be a middle-aged woman in a gray housekeeping uniform. He looked at the tactical map, at the dozens of his men's life sign indicators that had blinked out, extinguished one by one with methodical precision. He looked at the camera feeds, at the fleeting glimpses of a gray shadow moving through the darkness with impossible grace. His arrogance, the bedrock of his identity, crumbled into dust, replaced by a cold, existential dread. He was a wolf who had broken into a farmer's paddock, only to find a sheepdog was a dragon. He keyed his comms, his voice now stripped of its commanding swagger, thin and strained. All units, tactical retreat. I repeat, disengage and fall back to the exfil point. Mission is a scrub, but the reply was a cacophony of static and panic screams. Can't. She's cut us off. Bravo is down. She took them all down. She's in the vents. God, she's in the voice cut out with a wet gurgle. Elena was no longer just defending. She was hunting. The breach of the estate had been an insult. The dismissal of her as a domestic was a professional slight. The attack on her home, the place she had found a sliver of peace after a lifetime of war, was an unforgivable transgression. She moved through the mansion not with rage, but with a chillingly calm purpose. It was the same purpose with which she polished silver, the same focus with which she arranged flowers. It was a task to be completed, and she was the master of her craft. She used the house's integrated systems against them. The fire suppression system, designed to protect the art, was triggered in the library, filling the room with dense, oxygen-starving halon gas, forcing the mercenaries out into a prepared kill zone in the hallway. The automated blackout blinds, thick sheets of ballistic fabric, slammed down, separating squads and creating a maze of deadly corridors. She was a ghost in the machine, turning the smart home into a slaughterhouse. In the panic room, General Madsen directed Thorne to pull up a specific set of schematics. The West Wing, Marcus. The wine cellar. Is it still a pressure-sensitive vault? Thorne nodded, his eyes wide. Yes, state-of-the-art. Once it's sealed, nothing gets in or out. Madsen pointed to the screen. That's her endgame. She's not just defending. She's hurting them, he was right. Elena's movements, which had seemed random and chaotic, now revealed a terrifying strategy. She was a shepherd, and the wolves of the Iron Hundred were her flock. With surgical precision, she closed off escape routes, using calculated, non-lethal attacks to drive the remaining mercenaries away from the exits and deeper into the mansion's interior, funneling them inexorably towards the West Wing. Her legend, once a classified secret whispered in the highest echelons of power, was being reborn in the panicked comms chatter of dying men. They gave her a new name. Not Elena, not Rostova. They called her the Gray Shade. The validation of her skill wasn't coming from a medal ceremony or a commendation. It was being written in blood and fear on the marble floors of the Thorne estate, a testament delivered by the very men who had come to destroy it. The final act of the hunt took place in the long, cavernous corridor leading to the wine cellar. By now, only 20 of the original 100 mercenaries remained, including Warlock, who had abandoned his command post to join his men in a desperate last stand. Their morale was shattered. These were men who had faced down tanks and survived drone strikes, but they were not prepared for this kind of psychological warfare. They were fighting a force of nature, a legend made flesh. The corridor was a perfect bottleneck, 100 yards of polished marble with nowhere to hide. At the far end stood the imposing, circular vault door of the wine cellar. It was their only path of retreat. As they scrambled towards it, the lights in the corridor flickered and died, plunging them once again into darkness. A collective groan of terror went through the men. They knew what came next, but this time it was different. A single spotlight switched on, illuminating the space directly in front of the vault door. And standing in the center of the light, waiting for them, was Elena. She was no longer wearing the simple gray dress. She had changed into a pair of black cargo pants and a dark gray t-shirt, practical clothes taken from a guest bedroom. In her hands, she held no weapon. Her hands were empty, her posture relaxed. She simply stood there, a silent, immovable object in their path. Warlock raised his rifle, the red dot of his laser sight dancing on her chest. "Don't move," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "It's over." Elena's head tilted slightly, a gesture of mild curiosity. She took a single, deliberate step forward. The remaining mercenaries flinched as one. They had seen what she could do up close in the dark. To face her in the light was somehow even more terrifying. Her silence was more menacing than any threat. It was the silence of absolute confidence, the calm of a master who knew the outcome was already decided. Warlock screamed, a primal sound of frustration. "Who are you?" For the first time that night, Elena spoke. Her voice was not what they expected. It was soft, with a faint, unplaceable accent. It held no malice, no anger. It was the voice of a professional stating a fact. "I am the housekeeper," she said simply, "and you have made a mess." The profound, almost surreal irony of her words broke the last of their resolve. One mercenary dropped his rifle and ran, screaming, back down the corridor from which they had come. Another simply sat down on the floor and began to weep. Warlock, however, was consumed by a final, desperate surge of his shattered pride. "Light her up," he roared, and he and the last handful of his loyalists opened fire. The corridor erupted in a deafening storm of muzzle flashes and thunderous reports. They poured hundreds of rounds into the small circle of light. But when the echo of the last shot faded and the smoke cleared, she was gone. The light was empty, a moment of stunned silence. And then, from above, she dropped into their midst from an open air vent. She moved through them like a blur. It was not a fight. It was a disassembly. A hand twisted a rifle away. An elbow shattered a wrist. A foot swept a man off his feet. In seconds, it was over. Warlock stood alone, his rifle empty, clicking uselessly. Elena stood before him, her breathing even, not a single hair out of place. He stared at her, at the woman he had dismissed as a domestic. He saw his own monumental, fatal arrogance reflected in her calm, impassive eyes. He sank to his knees, utterly defeated, not by a weapon, but by a truth he had been too blind to see. Competence had a quality all its own. The legend of that night spread not like wildfire, but like a contagion. The few mercenaries who escaped, the ones who had fled in terror, told their stories in hushed, trembling voices in the shadow markets and mercenary dens from Macau to Marrakesh. They spoke of a siege, of a fortress, but most of all, they spoke of the gray shade, the phantom housekeeper who had single-handedly annihilated the legendary Iron Hundred. The story was embellished with each telling, as all legends are. Some said she could turn invisible. Others swore she could teleport. But the core of the story, the part that made hardened killers check their shadows, was always the same. They had underestimated a quiet professional, and it had cost them everything. Warlock was found by the authorities in the wine cellar, bound securely with steel wine-racking cables, sitting amidst the wreckage of his elite unit. He was a broken man. During his interrogation, he didn't speak of tactics or mission parameters. He spoke of his own hubris. "We saw her uniform," he whispered to the federal agent across the table, his eyes hollow. "We saw a servant. We never thought to look at her hands, the way she moved, the discipline. We judged the book by its cover, and the book was a weapon. He spent the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, his name becoming a cautionary tale for a generation of soldiers of fortune. The lesson was simple and brutal. Never mistake silence for weakness. Back at the estate, a profound change had occurred. Marcus Thorne, a man who had built an empire on ruthless calculation, had been given a lesson in a different kind of value. He watched Elena in the days that followed the attack. She did not speak of the incident. She did not ask for a raise or a commendation. She simply went back to her duties. She cleaned the bloodstains from the marble, repaired the bullet holes in the priceless artwork, and polished the silver. But everything was different. Thorne saw her not as an employee, but as a guardian. He saw the lethal grace in the way she pruned his roses, the strategic mind in how she organized the pantry. He saw the quiet competence that underpinned his entire, now secure world. He commissioned a small, simple plaque of black granite and had it placed discreetly by the entrance to the West Wing corridor. It bore no grand epitaph. It just said the Housekeeper's Hall. It was a place of pilgrimage for the new security staff, who were now trained not just in combat, but in observation, in humility. They were taught to look beyond the surface, to respect the quiet ones, to understand that the most dangerous weapon in any room is often the one you don't see. Elena never acknowledged the plaque, but sometimes, as she passed it on her rounds, a small, almost imperceptible smile would touch her lips. The lesson had been learned. The mess had been cleaned up. Months turned into a year, then two. The Thorne estate, once a symbol of opulent vulnerability, became a quiet fortress, its security now legendary. But its greatest defense was not the new walls or the advanced technology. It was the unassuming woman who still oversaw the household. Her reputation in the underworld had become mythic. No mercenary organization, no matter how desperate or well-paid, would take a contract on Marcus Thorne. The risk was not calculated in dollars, but in the certainty of annihilation. To attempt a raid on the Thorne estate was considered a form of professional suicide. The story of the Iron Hundred's fall served as an impenetrable shield. Elena, for her part, had found a strange kind of peace. Her war was over. The skills she had been forged with, once used in the shadows of geopolitical conflict, were now employed to maintain order and tranquility in her small corner of the world. She mentored the younger members of the security staff, not with lectures or drills, but by example. She taught them the power of observation, the virtue of patience, the strength found in silence. She taught them that true readiness was not about being loud, but about being prepared. Marcus Thorne's life was also transformed. The brush with death had stripped away his arrogance, replacing it with a deep, abiding sense of gratitude. He invested his billions differently, funding programs for veterans, creating quiet charities that operated without fanfare, reflecting the ethos of the woman who had saved his life. He learned from her that a legacy was not about the monuments you build to yourself, but about the quiet foundations you lay for others. The world saw him as a changed man, a philanthropist, a benefactor. But he knew the truth. He was merely a student, learning from a master whose greatest lessons were taught without a single word. His respect for her was absolute. He no longer saw her as staff, but as a partner in the quiet ordering of his universe, a silent sentinel who guaranteed his peace. Her presence was a constant reminder that the most profound strength is often invisible, that the most competent people have nothing to prove, and that respect is a currency earned not through boasts, but through action. The greatest power on earth is the quiet professional, the individual whose work speaks for itself, whose competence is so absolute that it requires no announcement. They're the foundation upon which everything else is built, the silent guardians who ask for nothing and give everything. Their reward is not fame or fortune. It is the simple, profound satisfaction of a job well done. The legacy of that night was not just in the stories of mercenaries or the changed life of a billionaire. It echoed in the very architecture of how people in that world thought about security, power, and identity. The concept of the gray shade became a piece of institutional folklore, a training scenario run at academies from Quantico to Hereford. It was a stark reminder for new recruits to shed their assumptions at the door. An instructor would hold up a picture of a smiling, grandmotherly woman and ask, threat or non-threat? The answer, now drilled into them, was always not enough information. Assumptions are a liability. The lesson was that the uniform does not make the soldier, and the title does not define the person. Worth is demonstrated, not declared. Elena Rostova, or whatever her real name was, became a symbol of this powerful truth. She never sought the spotlight, yet her shadow loomed large over an entire industry. She was a living testament to the idea that true mastery is quiet. It doesn't need to announce itself. It is felt. It is respected. It is, when necessary, feared. Her silence was not an absence of words. It was the presence of an unshakable confidence, a calm that came from knowing, with absolute certainty, that she was capable of handling any situation that arose. Her competence was her voice, and it spoke volumes. Years later, when Marcus Thorne passed away peacefully of old age, his entire fortune was left to a trust dedicated to helping veterans of clandestine services transition back to civilian life. The trust was to be administered by a board of one. The will stipulated that the position was to be held by Elena Rostova for as long as she wished. When the lawyers, men who dealt in the loud and boisterous world of finance and law, finally met her, they were taken aback. They expected a titan of industry, a formidable executive. They found a quiet, dignified woman in a simple dress, tending to the roses in the estate's garden. They saw a housekeeper, but as they spoke to her, as they felt the weight of her calm gaze and the precision of her few, carefully chosen words, they began to understand. They saw the quiet authority, the unshakable core of a person who had seen the world for what it was and was not impressed by their expensive suits or their legal jargon. They came to realize they were in the presence of someone whose life was a masterclass in the triumph of substance over style. She accepted the position with a simple nod. Her work was not done. There were other quiet professionals out there who needed a safe harbor, a place to find peace after a life of silent service. Her legacy was not what she had done on that one violent night. It was in what she would do every day that followed, quietly, competently, and without any need for applause. The story of the gray shade became more than a cautionary tale. It evolved into an inspirational parable. It was a story about the hidden strength that resides in the unassuming, a powerful narrative that championed the quiet doers over the loud talkers. It reminded a world obsessed with self-promotion and empty declarations that true value is built through disciplined action and unwavering competence. Elena's life at the helm of the trust was a continuation of her core philosophy. The organization she built was the quietest, most effective of its kind. It left no digital footprint. It issued no press releases. Its successes were measured in the lives it saved and the peace it provided to those who had lived in the shadows. It operated with the same silent efficiency as its founder. She became a mentor to a new generation, not of soldiers, but of healers, administrators, and guardians who understood that their impact was not measured by public recognition, but by the positive change they created in the world. She taught them that the most important work is often the most invisible. The final chapter of her story would never be written in a history book or a government file. It was written in the quiet, steady rhythm of her daily life. It was in the respectful nod from a former operator she had helped find a new purpose. It was in the peaceful silence of the garden she still tended. It was in the knowledge that she had built something that would endure, a legacy of quiet competence that would continue to ripple outwards long after she was gone. Her life was the ultimate refutation of the arrogant assumption that worth is tied to volume. She proved that silence can be the most powerful statement, that humility can be the sharpest weapon, and that true, undeniable skill will always, in the end, speak for itself. The world is full of noise, of people shouting for attention, demanding respect they have not earned. But beyond that noise, in the quiet corners, the real work is being done by the quiet professionals. They are the architects of our security, the guardians of our peace, the silent pillars that hold up the world. They ask for nothing, and they are owed everything. Their story is a reminder that you must never judge a person by their station, their title, or their uniform, but by the quiet dignity of their work and the steady competence of their hands. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.